All right, thanks so much. Really excited to have David Hughson with us, our head of sales at Remofirst. And yeah, this is going to be a fun conversation around onboarding and paying globally distributed talent. So Dave, let's start off just with a quick intro about you and Remofirst.
Sure. Thanks, Max. Thanks for having me. And we're, of course, very proud to be, a part of the session today. One of the things, Max and I have not met in person, but we live about a mile from each other in Boston. So it's good that we flew all the way to San Francisco to get together in person. I'm head of sales and marketing at Remofirst, and we're a company that help people hire talent in 150 countries around the world. And we're going to talk more about the complexities of that. But I've been with Remofirst for about 7 months now, but in the HR and international expansion space for about 15 years. So.
Amazing. And so, as you said, pretty new role for you at Remofirst, so offering employer of record services and compliance solutions for companies that have globally distributed teams. So quite a few of those companies in the house today. So for those in the audience who aren't intimately familiar with that concept, can you just break down what an employer of record is?
Yeah, sure. So I think, traditionally there were two ways in which companies would think about hiring talent globally. And the most traditional way that companies think about is physically expanding, their offices globally. So you might have a multinational company like Google who wakes up one day and says, you know what, we're going to plant a flag in a country like the UK, and we're going to set up an entity there, and we're going to pay taxes there, and then through that entity we'll now hire people. But the problem that creates is it's very time consuming and very complex, and for well-resourced organizations who have a lot of time on their hands, it's a great way to go. But for most companies who maybe want to hire a developer or a head of sales, it can be a very expensive proposition, and it's like trying to kill an ant with a sledgehammer. The other path that companies would take would be to engage independent contractors. So it's sort of the shortcut approach of saying, I met you on Friday, I want to pay you on Monday, and I think you have a special skill that can help develop my business, and so let's just put a paper contract together, and I'll start wiring you money when you do good things. That can work and should be a part of people's strategy when it comes to engaging talent globally, but that also has its limitations. And you have people who run into compliance issues around that. There's all sorts of things around employee misclassification. And in addition, there are a lot of candidates all around the world who would never want to engage with a U.S. company, for example, in that method, right? You want more assurances, you want more security through like a traditional employment contract. So employer of record kind of sits at the nexus of those two ends of the spectrum, which is this nice compromise of having entities in 150 countries around the world that you can employ talent through. So you have a more W-2 style employment relationship with your employer. You're just doing it through the employer of record. So you can do it quickly, you can do it in 5 to 7 business days, and you can do it without any of the complex headaches of setting up entities or any of the compliance risk of, engaging independent contractors who might actually be employees if somebody was really looking into it.
So, something that I've heard repeatedly from U.S. companies is that they have consciously avoided hiring full-time employees from outside the country because they're worried about running into international payroll processing issues that can be problematic to their business from a legal standpoint as well. And there's, co-founders in the audience today who are actively looking for international talent. So how would you say they best educate themselves on the complexities and regulations that are involved in hiring talent in multiple countries around the world?
So, I think a lot of the conversation today has been about, having remote teams and what comes along with that and, professional development and enablement. But it all starts with payroll and contracts, right? You have to start somewhere. And, I think it's right to have concerns around the legal and compliance aspects of things, because even though the whole world went remote a couple of years ago, it's not as though foreign governments all got together and said, hey, let's make it really easy for people to hire across borders. So a lot of the boundaries that have always been in place actually still exist. And so it's about, what can companies do to try to navigate that. So, I guess as far as educating themselves, the first thing that I would advise people on is, throw out your U.S. handbook. So there are a lot of organizations that when they think about first engaging talent, even if it's in some place like Canada that we think is very familiar to us, where they say, I'll just send them my U.S. offer letter, and I'll communicate my U.S. comp plan, and I'll probably offer a U.S. style benefits package. And while that's nice in theory, it creates all sorts of problems. And the problems could range from one, if you do it improperly, you actually could at that point open yourself up to significant legal and compliance risk, which I can get into more detail around. But there's also a candidate on the other side of this conversation who expects you as the potential employer to really understand their environment. What is it like to live and work in Portugal, and what kind of benefits would somebody who lives in Portugal expect? And maybe the person in Portugal expects their comp plan to be communicated to them in euros and not US dollars. And so the best thing you can do is slow down, throw out the US handbook, and then seek out, partners for advice on these things. So if you have an idea of the types of benefits that you might want to offer to a full-time employee in Portugal, try and understand what is already covered as a part of your employer taxes in Portugal, for example. And maybe offering private medical insurance is completely unnecessary or not relevant. And don't try to put things in foreign contracts that apply in the US. Maybe for you and I living in Boston, it might be quite common to have a non-compete or non-solicit agreement in our employment contract. Not in California, of course, but in most parts of the world, those are either illegal or unconstitutional, right? So you need to think that through. And then you can also unintentionally add a bunch of things into an offer to an employee that maybe then when it comes time to terminate that employee, let's say 2 years down the line, you're looking to move on or whatever it may be, you might have opened yourself up to all sorts of risk and cost because you agreed to something on the front end that you never should have. Right. And then just the last really important piece is that if you think that by taking a drafted U.S. employment contract and handing that to someone in Portugal, that will somehow stand up to, a Portuguese court of law, it won't, and you're going to be in a difficult position. So again, throw out the U.S. handbook, slow down, and get good advice before proceeding with any of those types of conversations.
So as a follow-up to that, also wanted to talk about just, from where you sit, what are the phases that a company has to think about as they go through setting up international payroll for the first time?
So I think back to, the first point about, there are still multiple ways in which you can engage an international team. And so I think considering the various options and saying, based on the type of work that this individual is going to be doing for you, could an independent contractor agreement actually be relevant? So, for example, is this someone who has a specialized skill that is going to be fulfilling a need for your organization, but maybe you only need them 17 hours a week, and maybe you're perfectly comfortable with them engaging other clients with other types of work, or is it somebody that you do need full time? And then from there, try to understand what are your business objectives in that jurisdiction. So is this a salesperson? Is this a developer? Is this a person who's going to be delivering customer service and support? And so by understanding kind of the role the individual is going to be playing and the needs you have as a business, now you can start to settle on, do I need an entity? Is that totally unnecessary? Is a contractor agreement relevant? Or would an employer of record be the right approach? Once you've discovered that, I think then engaging with some experts in either one of those categories before you communicate with the candidate is key. Because if you go and try to sit down across the table from that candidate and start negotiating what an employment relationship is going to look like without having taken that step first, that's where problems will start to arise, and ultimately you might risk losing the candidate. From there, the legal contract is the thing I would focus on next. So what are the components of an employment contract in this country that are very important? And I don't know how technical we want to get, but focusing on things like thinking worst case scenario, like what if I have to fire this person in 6 months? Like what kinds of things do I put in the contract to allow me some flexibility where that does not create significant additional costs for my business or open me up to potential legal downside? So you can put in place things like probationary periods and other terms that give you some flexibility on the front end before you engage an employee. From there, thinking about salary and currency, and do you want to ensure that the individual receives the exact same amount of dollars each month? Well, you got to think about that because the US dollar and the euro are constantly evolving against each other. And so those are the kinds of considerations you may want to take into account. Another thing that I think is really important while we're on the topic of currency is just the cost of engaging employees in these foreign countries. I think there's maybe a misconception that, it's just very expensive to engage employees overseas because we see that employer taxes are actually high in relative to the US. But in fact, there are a lot of benefits included for employees in those employer taxes that we then cover through like private medical and other things here in the US. So having a sense of the total employer cost before you go in, so you're not surprised then a few months down the line of like how much you're actually paying for this new employee in this new country, I think would be a great step as well.
So, over the past couple of years, we've seen this massive increase in the number of folks who are full-time remote employees, contractors. Many of them become digital nomads. They live in multiple countries throughout the course of the year. So from that standpoint, in terms of compliance, taxation, compensation issues, what type of issues does that pose for companies who are going about the process of hiring folks who are digital nomads?
Yeah, so I think digital nomads, like, first of all, this isn't something new as of COVID, as you know. I mean, people have been doing this for many years. There were a lot of trendsetters out there prior to COVID. But to give you an analogy of like what happened during COVID, like I bought a car during COVID and it was right at the height of COVID, I should say. And when I was done, with the financing component of it, they basically let me drive the car off the lot without like plates or registration because everything was closed. They were just like, we'll figure it out later. And there were a lot of different, I think formal processes like that we would all engage various government officials for that everybody kind of just waved their hands during COVID and said it's fine. And I think there's an analogy here to the digital nomad thing, which is everybody was like, it's fine. Like, I'll just travel all around the world. I'll spend a couple months here, a couple months there. No one's going to check. And I do think increasingly, as we go forward post-COVID, more governments are going to start to they want taxes paid, right? So if you're going to go and live in Costa Rica and sit on the beach and you're there for longer than 6 months, the Costa Rican government is going to say, okay, like I need, payroll taxes, or I need you to start, the employer potentially to start paying for those things. So I think it's important as the employer to, while you may want to embrace that type of opportunity for some of your employees, I think you have to be very clear as to what the potential downsides are for you. And that you can't necessarily just leave it up to the individual to understand how long can they be in a country, what types of documentation or visa status should they have depending on how long they're there, what taxes would they owe as a result of that, and potentially the risk that could open you up to as an organization. The UK has a law on the books called IR35, which pertains to independent contractors, for example, and it says that if you're an independent contractor working for my organization and you don't pay taxes that are owed as an independent contractor, even though I don't directly employ you, I might be liable for the back payment of taxes. So those kinds of things should be taken into account. In general, I think the proper way to engage a digital nomad probably is through an independent contractor arrangement, because if you're trying to decide which country that person is domiciled in and therefore which government's employment laws should dictate, in the case of a dispute, that can get very complex and can create a lot of headaches for you. So, to the extent that you can figure out a way to, retain them as an independent contractor and not go down the direct employment route, I think that's probably the right way to approach it. But of course, every situation varies.
For sure. And then just, as a follow-up to that, just in, conversations that you've had with, customers, with clients, are there, any that are taking any particularly like interesting approaches to working with digital nomads that have been successful?
Yeah, I think there have been some organizations that have basically tried to understand the landscape a bit better, and they put, in a kind way, put the onus on the digital nomad to say, look, we are fine if you want to live in these various countries, but let's understand the total compensation package that we're willing to pay you. And therefore, you need to figure out, is that going to work for you in Berlin versus in Mexico City versus, in Sao Paulo? And that the additional costs that could be there for the employer are going to be borne by the employee. So, if I'm going to pay you $100,000, that's all you're getting. Like, that's the total compensation I'm willing to provide you. And if your $100,000 turns into $60,000 in Sao Paulo, or it turns into $80,000 in Berlin, that's on you. You need to figure out the rest. It can be difficult if you're trying to manage that across a large population of your employees, but that is some of what we've seen. And then organizations like ours and some other folks in our space, we're also offering benefit to the employee. So we love engaging digital nomads. Like, it's a part of what we're trying to help enable. So we'll sometimes give them pricing discounts or bonuses and things like that if they use Remofirst, or to be paid as they're traveling around the world.
So at the outset, you mentioned you've been working in this space, helping teams expand globally for about 15 years. So from the vantage point where you sit, especially in this new role within Remofirst, what would you say have been the most noticeable evolutions that you've seen from hiring and onboarding strategy, especially in the last few years since the start of the pandemic?
Yeah, there have been, obviously a ton of changes. I think Dr. Bloom pointed that out at the beginning of the day, of just like what a massive shift we've seen in general. But, I think the thing I would start with is that this idea of global expansion used to be something that was sort of reserved for like boardroom conversations and like, is 2023 going to be the year that we, expand beyond the US or whatever it may be? And now I think people have woken up to the fact that this can be a part of your strategy really from day one. Or, we're a 100% remote company, and our team is across, 13 different countries, even though we're a small 50-person team. So the idea that it doesn't have to be this like fully thought out business plan that has, a budget assigned to it, that has shifted dramatically. I think the other thing, in 2021 and 2022, because of the pandemic, we all realized we could do this, right? Like, if somebody can be working from home in Boston, then what's the difference if they're sitting in Romania, other than time zone, of course. But so it was also about a scarcity of talent. It's like, well, I can't find these people in my backyard, wherever I may be, Chicago, Boston, LA, New York. So I might as well cast the net more wide. What I do think is going to start to happen is that organizations are going to think more strategically about the advantages of hiring global teams for budget reasons. So I think every organization, especially organizations that have a board, are getting tough questions about spend and customer acquisition costs and all of those wonderful things. And one way you can address that is by hiring the same qualified talent in various areas of your business, but doing it at a much lower cost, because you're going to parts of the world where the average cost of a developer, as obviously Turing is very familiar with, or the average cost of a sales executive or an SDR or a customer service person could be a third of that of what you might pay in some part of the United States. And so I think that being a strategic or an advantage that companies can take as they move forward would be a big change, I expect. The last thing I would say on that is, I think, we started talking about payroll, and because payroll is the thing that kind of drives the conversation, right? How do I get this person paid? Now, I think the conversation has expanded much broader than that. So instead of just offering payroll and benefits to an employee in a foreign country, now also this whole ecosystem of benefits has popped up of, device delivery, for example. Like, people underestimate how hard it is to get a laptop in the hands of a new employee that you hired in Cairo. And then from there, organizations being able to get their teams together for offsites. There are companies that are popping up to help support that kind of engagement. So I think just the innovation in the ecosystem around just how to engage global teams, how to provide additional benefits and support to them is something that, will continue to grow, in my opinion, in the year ahead.
Let's talk a little bit more about 2023. Yeah. So how do you think that 2023, especially in this current macroeconomic climate, how is that going to impact how companies go about the process of, looking to hire international talent?
Well, I think in general, they're going to be a bit more discerning in terms of like what it's going to cost them. I do think a lot of people threw caution to the wind in this sort of boom time that we've been in of like, whatever it costs, it's fine. This is great. We'll bring on this next person. I think now they are, back to my earlier advice, they are slowing down a little bit and going either, I really do want to have a good sense of what my total employer costs are going to be for engaging talent in country A versus country B. So, thinking a little more strategically about the country that they're hiring people in, and what the potential downsides are there from a cost perspective and compliance perspective. In addition, I think in terms of the people they partner with or the way they go about it, I think they're going to be a bit more discerning on that and being a little more cost conscious. So I think that is a big part of it, is just that strategic thought around cost, because I think that's just on everyone's mind right now. Yeah.
And then just, as a quick follow-up to that, so we've seen a lot of, interesting markets emerge just, from a geographical standpoint over the past couple of years. So we're just kind of interested in knowing, just within your own, customer or client ecosystem, if there is, demand for certain talent in certain regions that you're seeing grow, exponentially over the past couple of years.
For sure. I think, and I had a conversation with some of your colleagues about this last night, and I think it actually, our experience mirrors a little bit of what Turing has seen, but places like Latin America are definitely on everyone's radar. Part of the issue that we all encountered, as we've grown global teams, is the time zone concern. We have an amazing team in Eastern Europe doing a lot of development and customer success work, but there are inherent challenges just in the time zone, and from Boston to Kazakhstan, for example. So Latin America provides the benefits of talented workforce in various aspects of business, but a much more relevant time zone for people on the east and west coast of the U.S. So that's been something that we've seen. Eastern Europe continues to be a place of hot demand. Of course, because of what's going on in Ukraine, you're seeing other jurisdictions start to pop up as being like the next Ukraine, right? With that, the costs have risen in some of those locations for some of those roles as well. But then, there's still like insatiable demand for mobility across Europe. Portugal, everybody loves Portugal right now. Everybody wants to move to Portugal. That we're seeing a lot of interest there. But yeah, it's for us, Eastern Europe and Latin America, I would say would be the two hot spots as far as people saying, I think I want to expand my engineering team and I'm not sure how to do it. Where should I go? Right. So. Cool. Yeah.
All right. I know that this is a subject that is near and dear to the hearts of quite a few folks in the audience, so wanted to open up for questions for Dave at this point. Any questions out there? Sorry, it's kind of hard to see from this angle.
Oh, we get one there.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, my question is about how governments they are seeing this new movement, because for sure, for instance, in Latin America, a lot of the talents are now maybe working for U.S. companies, right? And what about the local companies? Do you see any governments being against this?
I don't see them necessarily being against this, because whether it's independent contractors, employers of record, ultimately, I think this is a stepping stone for a lot of organizations to having more robust presences in some of these countries and ultimately paying local taxes and hiring talent there, which is, I think, fits into that rising tide lifts all boats theme of international expansion. But they are not being any more lax in terms of their requirements around, employer taxes, how much they are scrutinizing independent contractor relationships and saying, is this actually an employer relationship? There are still, everyday things in the news about class action lawsuits against, for example, like ride sharing companies that are trying to treat people as independent contractors. So I haven't seen that slow down. So I guess in a sense, I think that it's a love-hate relationship for them of wanting to see companies move in and engage with their talent, but also wanting to get their pound of flesh as it relates to tax revenue and all of that down the line.
Yep, I think we've got a question right there up front. So just so everybody could hear it, the question is, what separates Remofirst from other companies that are in the employer of record space?
Yeah, I mean, good question. So first of all, I think there are a lot of great providers out there, which is a good thing for businesses today, that they have options. There are also different ways in which you can expand global teams. I think what Turing is doing is really incredible as it relates to building out engineering teams. But for us, the way we've looked at the market is around cost and providing high-level service to customers. I've been in the employer of record space with another provider earlier in my career, and one of the sort of themes that came out all the time was just how expensive it was to engage an employer of record, and that's probably the number one thing that we've tried to address is just the cost of doing business, the per employee per month fees, and trying to keep that as low as possible to help people scale with an EOR, but not sacrificing having, you know, a dedicated point of contact and somebody that you can work with each day. So we think we're pretty good at it, but we also know there are a lot of great providers out there that can do good work too. So thanks for the question.
Yep, got another question up front.
David, thanks for sharing the insights. One question to you. If you have to pick one country, which would be where you would like to stay for work-life balance, taxation, working remotely? What would be your one country that you would recommend?
It's a great question. It's December, and Max and I both live in Boston, so I would think someplace warm. No, I actually, I am fascinated by what's going on in Portugal. I actually just hired someone on my team from Lisbon, and he just seems so happy all the time. And so, no, I mean, joking aside, I would love to like check out parts of Western Europe, and if I could do it for 6 months. I have 2 young kids that make that a little challenging, but someday.
It's hard to beat Portugal.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really what it comes down to.
Cheap
at the end of the day.
wine, you know.
Right,
warm
exactly.
weather, yeah.
Right. Great weather. Lisbon's one of the best cities in Europe. Yeah, tough to beat.
Yeah.
More questions out there. We've got one up there.
Hello.
Hey.
Is there a point you think where it makes sense to expand globally for a team and where it might not make sense? Where, as in, I guess, when you're in a revenue growth period where it might make way more sense to grow globally as opposed to trying to nail your home niche?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's important to separate like market expansion versus team expansion. So it's a good question. I think market expansion, if you're somebody that has a product or service, like we have a lot of companies in our portfolio, our investors' portfolio that are fintech companies where when you build a product, you know, it's very specific to your home market because you're aligning to SEC regulations or other things. And so I do think for organizations that have that challenge, it can make sense to hold back before you decide to say, I'm now going to go from offering this in the US to offering this in Europe to offering this in APAC. The team expansion component of it, to me, there's no bad time. You know, if you feel like you can get a diverse set of perspectives into your team, a diverse set of skills that maybe have seen, you know, different flavors of industry, I think there's no bad time for that, even at a very early stage. And the number of founders that we talk to who are like the co-founders aren't even in the same time zone, that amazes me. You know, one's living in New York and the other person's living in Tel Aviv. Like, there's a lot of that still going on. And so, you know, at the earliest stages, people are starting global from day one. But good question.
More questions out there? If not, I've got a couple more for Dave.
Okay.
Cool. So a couple more before we finish up. So we also talked a little bit more about just, you know, industries that are, you know, hiring, you know, quickly even, you know, in these economic times. So I was interested in knowing just from, you know, from your vantage point, what you're seeing in terms of specific industries, you know, within the U.S. that are starting to really ramp up their focus on hiring employees internationally.
Yeah, I think it actually aligns a lot to, you know, what Dr. Bloom was pointing out around tech still being the outlier. I mean, even with like inbound traffic that we see where we're not necessarily going out and selecting those customers, it's still overwhelmingly tech organizations. And then within that, fintech actually has been the one that we've seen the most. So even crypto and some of those businesses, which obviously are in a bit of a, you know, state of flux, are still thinking about hiring people globally. One of the interesting things for crypto businesses is for many of them, having entities in various countries can be problematic because of some of the regulatory uncertainty. So, you know, they tend to come our way fairly often. But then there's a more diverse range of industries that are taking advantage of outsourcing components of their customer success, for example, that look at places like